Welcome to the Truth and Fertility Podcast. I'm Haley, wife, mom, and a fertility charting instructor, here to teach you the undeniable truth about your fertility. So let's get started. Welcome to the Truth and Fertility Podcast. Today, I am chatting with Anne-Marie Williams. She is the host of the Postpartum On Purpose podcast. And today we are talking just about that. We're talking about everything postpartum. I don't know if you could consider, I have a 1-year-old, so I don't know if you could consider myself I don't know if a year postpartum is a thing, but I definitely still feel like I'm in that. So this topic is very near and dear to my heart. I've gone through some things with like postpartum depression and just all the things that you can think of with postpartum. So this is a really amazing topic, and no one better to talk about it with than Anne-Marie. So Anne-Marie, if you could please just introduce yourself to our listeners, and then we'll start the conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And it's just funny because every time somebody is on a podcast and they say, "Thanks for having me here. Thanks for having me." I'm like, "You're not having me. You are far away. You're nowhere. We're not sitting down together." And yet that was about what just came out of my mouth. Thanks for having me here. But my name is Anne-Marie. I am wife to James and mom to 5 kids now and 1 miscarried baby. My oldest is 9. My youngest is 2 months and a week. And I got a degree in nursing and practiced as a nurse for 8.5 years, and then got into some freelance writing. And then for the last several years have been an assistant editor, and then managing editor at Natural Womanhood. And I just stepped out of that role as my daughter was born, just with time constraints. But through the lens of nursing and want to really pursue evidence-based medicine and then personal experience with fertility awareness, that sort of opened my heart a little bit to just looking at pregnancy and labor and birth as a time of opportunity. And the more postpartums I have accumulated, I'm increasingly seeing postpartum as a very specific time. I think when I first started out having babies, I viewed it as sort of the messy leftovers, like the bloody leftovers of birth. But the more time I've had, and honestly, the more struggle that I've encountered along the way, and we'll get into that later on, the more I'm seeing postpartum as a very specific time, as an opportunity for grit, to show girl grit, and then a time for growth. And that could be a growth, usually growth in both skills, but then also in your mindset. And then an opportunity for grace, because there are just times, moments, maybe whole seasons of time within that. I consider postpartum like at least the first year after birth. But just times when it's like, Lord, I am leaning on your grace right now, because there's an end. There is an end to the skills and the mindset that I have, and yet more is needed. More is needed here. So yes, I've become very, very passionate about the postpartum period, and also very specifically about how we can get women support that doesn't just rely on a mom, like a mom friend group, because oftentimes, right, if you are in the thick of it and they are in the thick of it, they may not be able to help you in the ways that you need. And so sort of my hill that I will die on is finding and forming your grandma tribe, other people who may be able to help you when your mom friends will be your ride or dies for texting and laughing and joking, but may not be able to step in and actually physically, tangibly help you. And how do we get women access to that if they don't have family in town or down the street or what have you?
Got it. Okay. So you said you were a nurse. Were you specifically like in OB, or where did this passion for postpartum come from?
Right. So that's what's funny. The very first year I was in nursing, and I practiced for 10 years, and then I've been outside the hospital for 4 years now. The very first year I was on antepartum, which I had never even heard of before I applied to that unit.
Yeah, what is that?
That's moms who are in high risk pregnancy. So before birth, that's moms who either their pregnancy's high risk because of a problem with them or a problem with baby, or maybe just like a medical condition that they have that has made their pregnancy high risk. So they're on bed rest in the hospital. That was my first year of nursing. I actually did not prefer it. I think it was mostly the unit that I was on, just the culture of that unit. I don't know that it was necessarily the type of nursing. But then I went on to be an adult ICU nurse for 8.5 years. So the nursing aspect of it really informed my desire for what does the evidence tell us in terms of what does research say about what is helpful or most helpful for moms? What are the things that we need? what does research tell us about postpartum depression is one example. But yeah, I would just say simply that I found my own training and preparation for the postpartum period lacking. Uh, I would say with baby number 2, because with baby number 1, I don't know about you, but I wasn't really stretched beyond my means. Like I could handle
Yeah.
one baby. I could handle one baby. It was an uncomplicated birth and postpartum went pretty smoothly. And so really he fit, so to speak, into the lifestyle I was already living. But when the second baby came and she actually had major surgery at 2 days old, and I'm a nurse and I will just glide through this. And then 6 weeks later, the gliding stopped. And I experienced a pretty significant panic attack. And then several years followed of thinking, and this actually ties into your experience that you shared on your own podcast recently about pursuing like hormonal treatments for postpartum depression, because that was the only framework that I had, Haley, was this idea that like this is probably a hormonal thing. And so I thought, okay, well then I need progesterone. And I counted myself very lucky because I knew that that was a thing, that you could get an APRO doctor to prescribe you progesterone. And so I was expecting it to be this magic pill, really. I mean, it's a shot, but I was expecting the magic shot. And that just simply was not my experience. It did not. It did not really improve it in any meaningful way. But I continued to beat that horse into the ground. And once my labs came back, because I was charting my cycle, of course, right? I'm charting my cycle and my cycle's returned and all of my numbers are within normal limits. And yet I still feel really rough, really anxious. And I would say that it was actually much more anxiety than depression, which also made me confused because I had only ever heard of postpartum depression. I had no concept of all of the PMADs, right? The perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, no concept of them at all. And so then I moved on to trying thyroid. Like, is there something wrong with my thyroid? And is that what's causing this? And very, very briefly tried just the tiniest touch of thyroid medicine, because really my numbers looked pretty good there too. That didn't help anything. And it was just like, And then when my daughter, so that was after the birth of my second child, that sort of like kicked off into a very significant way, or in a very significant way. She was 3. She was 3 before things really came to a head. And I would say it was just like kind of a downhill sort of slide, but slowly. And I was trying, right? Like I was legitimately trying the things that I thought were going to help. And what I was experiencing, but didn't have the term for it at the time, were intrusive thoughts. And so an intrusive thought, just for those who maybe aren't familiar with that term, is a persistent, insistent, and consistent thought that comes into your mind that is not representative of you or your values, right? But I was having these intrusive thoughts. I was so frightened of the things that were occurring to me in my mind, so terrified to let anybody else know, because I was certain, as this is the experience, right? I was certain that other people would think I was crazy. And I already sort of was believing that because of the thoughts that were occurring to me. And so I was like, I don't want somebody else to confirm it for me. And so I ended up in the ER one night when my daughter was like 3.5, because I could not get these thoughts out of my head. And I was so afraid that I was going to act on them. And what's interesting is that nobody recognized that what I was experiencing was anxiety related to OCD, that intrusive thoughts were a classic feature of OCD. So they were telling me, they were assessing me in this lens of depression and saying, well, you're not a danger to yourself because X, Y, and Z. So they were looking through this lens of, you're experiencing a depressive episode, but it's like, looking back now with what I know now, but didn't know then, nobody recognized, oh, those are intrusive thoughts you're experiencing. And that's a hallmark of OCD. And so several more years passed. I had another son, and then I had another son. So I had 4 children total. And then when my second youngest, he's 2 years old now, but when he was born, as it turned out, it was a very traumatic experience. Not because anything was wrong with him, but because nobody recognized he was about to come. And so there was no doctor in the room, and my water broke in the middle of the floor, and he came out 30 seconds later. Still, all of this is still, he's totally healthy. There's nothing wrong with him. There's nothing wrong with me. but every single person who came into that room perceived and treated it as an emergency. So all of the things that you would do, you whisk the baby away to the warmer right away, you clamp the cord immediately, there's no skin to skin time. There was the resident came in, said no words to me, and just like had her arm up in me up to the elbow, like without explaining or anything, because everybody thought it was an emergency, because nobody realized she was coming, because the people that were caring for me were not trained in unmedicated birth. And so they were not able to read my body to see, oh, it's about time. And so the intrusive thoughts that had sort of calmed down after that experience in the ER, because I'd gone to counseling for a year after that. And the counseling had been really helpful for helping me to develop better dynamics for communication with my family, but then also just like healthier ways of communicating with people around me and recognizing my own limits. But because nobody had recognized you are experiencing intrusive thoughts, and because, to be truthful also, it was hard for me to get the words out of my mouth of what I was experiencing, they were still there because that had not been addressed. But as anxiety built after my second youngest he was a year old, and I went back to the same counselor and I said, I think I'm really upset about my labor experience, but I'm much more anxious than I should be. And that time she listened to what I said and she said, that sounds just like OCD. That sounds just like postpartum OCD. And so she administered, it's called the Y box. It's a diagnostic screening tool, or I'm not sure if it's a screening tool or diagnostic. So I guess I shouldn't say that one for the other, or one for sure, because I'm not super sure of that, but it's at a minimum a screening tool for OCD. And once I knew that, she recommended 2 books that made so much sense of so much of my experience throughout my entire life. What had been like a very low level, I would say, or sort of like always in the background, some tendencies. But I was able to see like, oh, this is what this is. And the gold standard treatment for OCD is ERP, exposure and response prevention therapy. And it actually was not something I was able to do with that therapist. I needed to find somebody who was specifically trained in that. And I started that in January of this year. And it made the most significant difference. Like intrusive thoughts that I have experienced for, at this point, my daughter is now 7 3/4 years old, right? Like I just thought this is what it is. Like this is just going to be terrible forever. And once I began working with an ERP trained therapist, it was like, oh, the needle actually legitimately shifted. And so when I started the podcast, it was in May of 2024, and I was trying to make some sense of my own experience at the time, but also to pass on the things that I had gleaned and the wisdom that I had learned over time. But I've kept going as just as I've recognized, like, oh, there is so much value to this time, but there's also so much support that's needed. And so much of what I see during postpartum related content is centered on the baby, and is really important to me that we center on the mom, that we are able to look at her first and recognize that we will get that healthy baby if we can first get the mom. We have to get the mom first. So that's the super long answer.
That was, oh my gosh,
to where this comes from.
What a compelling story too, just for the sake of, I think intrusive thoughts are, I mean, it's definitely something that I have experienced as well, and do continue to experience. I mean, I've never, though, made the connection between intrusive thoughts and OCD. So I would love to pick your brain more about that, because I think so many of us, like I actually started having those thoughts, like just thoughts of like either harming myself, harming another, and just very, as you were saying, very scary thoughts. That's like, it is not me, but why the heck is my brain, you know?
Yes.
And so I started having those in my first pregnancy. So like, it wasn't even a postpartum thing. It was a pregnancy thing for me. And so, but seeing a counselor, I've been working through it a lot, and that has been super helpful. But I've never heard of that being a connection to OCD. Can you go into that a little bit more? Like, what are the connections there?
Sure. And I suppose this sounds so silly, like I'm some I am not a medical expert. I have a nursing degree, but I'm not a medical expert. And I always hear people put that caveat, and it's like, why? Of course you don't. Like, of course you're not a medical expert. But I guess I just want to preface what I'm saying with, this is what I've learned, this is what I've
Sure.
experienced. And if somebody is hearing something and what I'm saying, think like, oh, that sounds kind of like me. Just don't let me be the end of your exploration is how I'll
Yes.
phrase that.
Yeah.
Um, but what I learned was that intrusive thoughts are a hallmark of obsessive compulsive disorder. And my only exposure to or understanding of OCD when I was growing up was excessive hand washing. Well, that wasn't a problem for me. That wasn't. I'm a nurse. I wash my hands a lot, but it's not like, if I had a problem with germs, I would not have entered into that profession. And
Right.
so that was my only conception of what OCD was. And what I learned is that there are different sort of flavors, so to speak, but one of them, and the one that I experienced in particular, is called pure OCD, and that's mental compulsions. So obviously the obsessions are mental, but the compulsions are mental as well. And so, like, as one example, checking is a very common mental compulsion in response to trying to calm down the anxiety from the obsessive thought you feel. So you perceive a thought, it frightens you, it scares you, it makes you uncomfortable. The compulsion is the thing that you do to try to let that push that anxiety down, to
Right.
decrease the
Okay.
anxiety. And in the short term, let's say you're reassuring yourself. That's another compulsive response. You're reassuring yourself, okay, well, this is why I don't have to worry about this. This is why I'm not actually crazy. This is why I'm not going to do this terrible thing that occurred to me. Like, you're trying to reason with yourself. With OCD, the more you reason with it, the more entrenched it becomes. And that is where you have a distinction between cognitive behavioral therapy, right, which is the standard for a lot of different types of mental health issues. But cognitive behavioral therapy for OCD can actually only reinforce those obsessive thoughts. And so you can actually, and this is my experience as well, you can actually make them stronger by treating them as reasonable and arguing through them. There's a lady who I learned of, her name is Shayla Nicely, which doesn't sound like a real name to me, but is in fact that lady's name to my understanding. But she talks about OCD as the obsessive thoughts being like a man with a megaphone in the park screaming about the end of the world, right? And the compulsion is going over there and taking one of this man's pamphlets, like what he's saying is legitimate. But what she talks about is how, if you are learning to tame the OCD, gradually the man in the park is still there and he's still shouting, but you're not even breaking stride. You're not turning to face the thought. It's not like you're ignoring it. And she talks about an intermediate step being may or may not statements. So whereas OCD says X bad thing, what if X bad thing happened? Instead of saying it's not or it's going to happen, you just say may or may not. And OCD hates that because the
Yeah.
three pillars of it, she says, are a desire for 100% comfort, 100% certainty, and 100% control. And our compulsions are our responses to our desire for 100% certainty, 100% comfort, and 100% control in any given situation. And so it makes perfect sense that during a time of great hormonal upheaval, which could be pregnancy, right, or could be postpartum. And in my experience, I would say it ratcheted things up with my son, that he had this birth that really, when I looked back, the more that I looked back on it, the more frustrated I was by it. That, right, can exacerbate it because in that experience, I was out of control, right? I
Yeah.
didn't have 100% certainty, 100% control, and so on. So yeah, that's what I've learned about it. There are several books that were super helpful to me. One of them is called Pure OCD. And then the other two, I could get you the titles of them, but it helped me to understand what I was looking at. Because
Yeah.
before it just felt so nebulous, but also so terrifying that it was just like, I just want to curl up in a ball because I don't know how to fight this. And another example that was super helpful to me was that picturing OCD like a TV that is on a channel that is just doom and gloom all day long. And you can't turn it off. You actually can't turn it off. Your brain will continue, right, to ping pong all over the place. And especially at first, as you're learning what's going on and learning to change your responses to it, the TV channel is set. But what you can learn to do is to not press your nose against it. What you can learn to do is to back up so that you can take in more of what's actually happening around you, so that you're able to recognize, oh, this is just a show on a television and this is not reality. So that's something. And I will just say the gold standard for OCD is exposure and response prevention therapy. And most people are familiar with the idea of exposure therapy, right? Like you're afraid of heights, and so you're going to go to a tall building, what have you. Okay. But exposure and response prevention therapy specifically says, I'm going to go on purpose, expose myself to this thing that I know will cause me anxiety, but I'm going to prevent the compulsive response. I'm going to expose myself to the anxiety, and I'm going to prevent the compulsive response. And that is the way that, generally speaking, it's not going to be like going into the deep end right away, right? You'll work with an ERP trained therapist, and they'll stair step you until you're ready to take on more and more challenging things. But like, for instance, for myself personally, doing ERP this spring in preparation for this postpartum, one of the things I've always been terrified of is postpartum psychosis, or some type of like, I'm going to go crazy. I'm not going to be able to take care of my baby. And so I started out with just reading some stories about postpartum psychosis or postpartum, like severe postpartum depression. And then I was able to listen to podcast episodes. And then I was able to watch a documentary about postpartum psychosis, which I could never have imagined, because that was something that over the course of my life, I had always told myself, well, there's certain things I just can't handle. I can't read about that, hear about that, watch that horror movie. Like, nope, I can't do that. I can't do that. It will break me, is the thought that I had. And so gradually over time, I exposed myself to the thing that caused me anxiety, prevented the compulsive response of reassuring myself that it wasn't going to happen. And then very gradually was able to handle more and more and more, until I got to a point where it was like, okay, I don't want this experience to happen to me, but I no longer believe that it's going to, just because I don't want it to. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Everything you're saying is gold. Okay, first of all, I love the analogy of the guy in the park yelling. Like, that is so good, because it gives you, because that's pretty much what I've learned in therapy too, on how to handle these intrusive thoughts of like, don't give them the weight that they're trying to put in your brain. Like, don't give them the weight, just let them come in one ear and out the other. And especially like for me, there were a few things too that like would trigger those thoughts as well. Like if I was working with something specific and in my house, I would have that it would trigger a specific thought. And so I couldn't get away from the thing. I don't want to say it specifically, because I don't want to put ideas into anybody's brain. But like there was a specific thing that would trigger those thoughts. But I couldn't get away from doing that specific task in my house. So it was like, okay, while I'm doing this task then in my house, I'm that exactly what you're saying of that exposure. What was it again? Exposure
and response prevention. ERP is what it's called.
Okay. ERP.
Yeah.
That's pretty much, you're putting into words exactly what I was experiencing. Like you're putting yourself in the moment of, okay, I know that this thought is going to be triggered, and just not even giving it the time of day, just letting it go. And so that the idea of the guy yelling in the park, like, no, you don't pay attention to that guy, because he's not speaking truth. And so you just let it be. And so I absolutely love that. And so I want to make sure that I'm getting it clear, the connection of like the OCD. So because with obsessive compulsion disorder, you have an obsession, and then the compulsion is on how are you basically kind of dying down that obsession. Maybe not dying down is the best word, but
it's how you're trying to
that obsession.
Yeah. It's how you're trying to get rid of the anxiety that comes from thinking that thought. So you
Right.
have the anxiety, and this is how you're trying to fix it, so to speak. But
Yes.
the more that you reason and engage with it, what you're doing is telling your brain, this is a legitimate threat to me.
Okay.
And so
Yeah.
that's why over time, even though in the moment, right, let's say, for example, let's say you're like, I can't I don't know, I can't walk through this doorway in my house. Okay, well then I just won't walk through that doorway ever again. Okay, avoidance is a very clear tactic. Now you and I, right, we would laugh, we'd say, well, you have to walk through that doorway in your house, and so like you can't avoid it forever. But avoidance is a way that we say, I feel anxious every time I go near that door, and so I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to avoid it. That is the compulsive response to this obsessive thought.
Yeah.
I don't know what you think is going to happen when you walk through the door, but whatever. But ERP therapy would say, I'm going to walk through the door. I'm going to allow it to be comfortable, and I will do it enough times until I'm able to walk through it. And slowly, that anxiety response from a physiological perspective, it cannot stay at a 10 forever. And
Right.
I'm going to stay here or keep coming here or what have you until slowly my body learns, oh, this thing I'm terrified of happening or myself doing or fill in the blank, whatever the specifics of it are. I am able to slowly separate, I believe it's going to happen
Mhm.
from it may or may not. I start that's the intermediate step, right? Well, it may or may not happen, but I'm going to go through that door anyway. And then eventually, I don't even give the time of day to the thought that something bad's going to happen when I go through that door. I'm going to do something bad when I walk through that door. Does that make sense?
Yes, it totally does. Yeah. Yeah. And that's pretty much exactly what even with just working with my own therapist and working through that and just being like, okay, there's the thought and let's let it be. Like, you don't have to reason with it. You don't have to explain yourself about it. Them out
Yes,
loud to a therapist is very hard but helpful. Like,
yes,
so those types of
yes.
things. So definitely, for if anybody's listening right now and this is kind of tugging at a heartstring and you've been experiencing these things, like 100% go see a therapist and don't be afraid of yourself. Just recognize that, like, okay, here are some steps that I can take to help, right?
Yeah.
So the next thing I wanted to ask you too is the connection between this postpartum OCD or like mixed in with anxiety, let's say,
Yeah, absolutely.
versus the postpartum depression. Because earlier you talked about getting the postpartum progesterone shots, and also for those listeners that aren't familiar with that, I will link an episode in the show notes that I've done on explaining what these progesterone shots are. But
Hmm.
basically, it's kind of a newer way of helping with postpartum depression, and that when you are postpartum, your hormones are naturally just dumping, like they are
Hmm.
just, yeah,
Hmm.
they're depleted. And so giving yourself that boost of progesterone can help maintain that balance and that equilibrium. And so that's kind of been a newer process of helping women with depression. But what I'm hearing from you is that your intrusive thoughts, which we now understand is postpartum anxiety, that was that not necessarily a hormonal thing for you, and that's why the progesterone shots didn't work? Like walk me through that.
Yeah, so my understanding is that, so okay, this is something that I heard from a NAPRO trained nurse practitioner that I worked with when my daughter was 3 years old, and it was like, my hormones are fine, I don't understand what's happening. She's like, yes, it's true that your hormones tank when the baby is born, but that is a physiological thing. It happens to everybody, and not everybody experiences depression. And she said that to me several times. Like, that hormonal drop is physiological, right? So it's not quite right to say that it's a hormonal imbalance, because that's actually naturally what every woman's body does. But not everybody experiences this. And so, yes, for some women are going to be more hormonally sensitive. And we actually find this is a little bit tangential, but we actually find that women who experienced hormonal related depression after going on hormonal birth control, this is not my experience, but just speaking of it in general, those women may be at higher risk of experiencing postpartum depression as well. So in women who are more hormonally sensitive, we may see a more hormonal related depression. Now, in my experience, that didn't help. And I can't speak for anybody else. I can just simply say, it didn't make the symptoms go away. But that actually makes sense to me because I had spent decades building certain thought patterns and ways of responding to uncertainty, discomfort, and lack of control. And so, yeah, a shot was probably not going to address that, so to speak, certainly not in a way that was going to fix it long term. One interesting thing about depression symptoms in relation to OCD is that while OCD is primarily anxiety related, like fear of something that's going to happen, right? And we think about depression as being more, I'm so sad or despairing about something that I perceive is happening or has happened. We can be depressed as a compulsive response to anxious thoughts. So if an anxious thought says, well, I'm going to fill in the blank, the depression is a compulsive response saying, yeah, that's right. That's for sure going to happen. And then the depression can come on top of that. Does that make sense? So the anxiety was there first. The depression is our compulsive response to say, yes, it's true. Whatever it is going to happen. It is going to happen. So yeah, I think that's probably as much as I ought to say, not knowing any particular person's case and only speaking about my own. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that makes a lot of sense too, because you're looking even farther back than even your pregnancies. You're looking back at the tendencies that you had beforehand. And that also jives with my story too, because I have a long family history of anxiety and depression just in general. And so for me, it really comes specifically to pregnancy and postpartum, but that is, woman is experiencing a very heightened fluctuation of those hormones and everything. But that can be just an added on to the anxiety or depression that you're already kind of at a baseline experiencing. And so then add in those hormonal fluctuations and, you know, whether it is an imbalance or just like a physiological hormone dump, right? That can just add on to that. So that makes sense. And you know, it's interesting too, because now I'm thinking back on when I had those progesterone shots. I had 2 rounds of them. And while I was in the middle of the shots, so typically what the shots look like is you take one every other day for 10 days. So there's 5 shots every other day for 10 days. So I did 2 rounds of those. And I remember when I was in the middle of them, I was feeling a little bit better. Like I felt a little bit relieved. But once I ended the round, I would just go like right back to where I was. So it makes sense that like if you're at a baseline, that hormonal fluctuation can add on to that. But you really have to be looking at, okay, but there's still this baseline of anxiety and depression here. How do I handle that? And that takes us even farther back than just the pregnancy. Yeah. So that makes a lot of sense.
I think something that's been very helpful to me is to look at an analogy, and I'm not saying it's perfect, but to look at the analogy of gestational diabetes. I used to understand gestational diabetes as a temporary thing that you experience while you're pregnant, and then it goes away. Like it goes away once the baby's born. But I read I think it was Real Food for Pregnancy by Lily Nichols, who's just an excellent dietitian. She has really excellent work. She has Real Food for Pregnancy, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, Real Food for Fertility now that she co-authored with somebody else. But she talks about how I believe the statistic is 70% of women who experience gestational diabetes will get a type 2 diabetes diagnosis within 5 years. So really, she looks at it as we are just recognizing during pregnancy that you are a diabetic. And I think of the postpartum OCD. I'm not saying this for everybody. I'm simply saying what I look at in myself is that tendencies that I have had for a long time, they were exacerbated to the point that they became like needed to be dealt with during postpartum. So I don't look at it for myself as it's postpartum OCD and then at some arbitrary point at 6 months, it's going to be gone, right? Or whatever. I look at it as these are the tendencies that I experience. They are more intense during postpartum, right? Because not just do you have this hormonal drop right away, you have some degree of sleep deprivation, and we all have different levels of sensitivity to that. Jen Fulwiler in her book, Your Blue Flame, talks about sleep temperament.
I love Jen Fulwiler.
Isn't that fun? Yeah. And so sleep temperament made so much sense to me. And I can't get There's something she's talking about a friend or herself saying that part of their sleep temperament was that when they are sleeping, they sleep deeply, such that it's like they're being cryogenically preserved. I think is
Yeah.
what she said. It's like,
Was
yeah,
this
it
in
would
her
be
book
hard.
when she said that?
Yes,
The
it
blue
was in,
flame? Yeah,
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 it
yeah.
was in River Flame. But she's like, well, yeah, it would make sense. It'd be hard for you to wake up if that's how deeply you're sleeping.
Yes.
But anyhow, so during postpartum, right, you have sleep deprivation on top of it. And then what other complications might you have? Do you have health problems? Does your baby have trouble breastfeeding? This is my 5th live birth, miscarriage 5 years ago, but 5th live birth. I had 4 babies who breastfed, really no problems. This time, my daughter is just having lots and lots of trouble, like gulping air, or even just like not managing her air well. Even if she's not gulping, like she has puked up a feeding so many times. That ends up taking a lot of your time, effort, and energy because it's like, okay, well then how soon after that do I feed her? Do I need to feed her extra? Is she gaining enough weight? Right? That would be OCD's playground. To be
Yeah.
like,
I
I'm
say
not in
so.
complete control of this. I don't have certainty about how it's going to end, and I am quite uncomfortable with
Yeah.
this existence. So right. So I would just simply say, like, I think the conditions are ripe for all sorts of mental struggles, depending on like baseline, as you said, perhaps whatever you're bringing into the pregnancy and or postpartum. But then on top of that, as well, saying like, but how did your pregnancy go? Okay, but how's your postpartum going? We have all of these things. And then if you have, like I have, and you have as well, older children, okay, well, around here, we have about a 2-week honeymoon period with a new baby. Everybody is just gelling and clicking and working. And then after that, the wheels do not fall off the cart, but they wobble awfully hard. And so that takes several months to stabilize. And this happens every time. And the more children that we have, the more people are going through this destabilization period. So it's just like, okay, we've got all these levels and layers of things going on. And it's only this postpartum that I'm able to see, like, oh, the more out of control I feel of any given particular situation, right? The more these thoughts are going to come up and be like, this is serious and you need to pay attention, right? Because isn't that the way with intrusive thoughts? This is serious and you need to pay attention. And so just being able to look not at the thoughts as like, I need to dissect this, but just to look and see like, oh, that's what this is. Okay. I don't need to spend energy. I'll spend some energy. I'm a human being, a tired human being. I'll
Yeah.
spend some energy before I'm able to recognize like, oh, this is what I'm doing. This is what's
Yeah.
happening. But I just think, yeah, there's so much in postpartum in particular that can make that mental health space difficult.
Yeah. I'm curious to know, earlier you said that with your first baby, you didn't experience really any of this. And it was only until your second that you did.
Yeah.
And I know you mentioned too that your second had a pretty serious surgery as a newborn. So I'm sure
Mhm,
that that
mhm.
was a huge, huge deal. But I'm curious to know why you think that you didn't have any of this experience with your first.
I think that I could just keep pushing and didn't ever have to slow down enough to actually sit with my own thoughts. But when your daughter is in NICU for 5 days, you have a lot of time to just sit, right? And if you're not medicating with your phone or some other substance, right, of choice, postpartum is actually also a very slow time. And if you're a naturally driven, ambitious, maybe perfectionistic tendencies type of a person, postpartum is also going to put you face to face with your thoughts and your inner world. And I think with my son, I don't know. I didn't have to slow down. I wasn't taxed beyond what was available, like what I was able to do and handle and just kind of keep rolling. Now, don't get me wrong. We do incorporate our children into our life, right? So of course we recognize nap times and routines and all this for them, but I take my kids with me most everywhere. I'm pretty game to go most places with the 5 of them, even if it is kind of messy, because I think that for the vast majority of places and spaces, we can make it work with children. I really do believe that. But um, yeah, that first pregnancy, I don't even think I had to like adjust much of anything. in
Yeah.
that postpartum. And I will say I was terrified that I was going to experience postpartum depression. I was so afraid it was going to happen, as if
Hmm.
I had absolutely no
Which is
control,
anxiety.
which is anxiety,
Yeah.
which is an obsessive thought.
Yep. Yeah.
But I didn't have to slow down. And I think that's another thing that's just become increasingly important to me over time, and to really communicate in the most gentle and generous way that I know to women through the podcast, is this idea that we don't have to be afraid of that slow. We don't have to be afraid of that slow. This is an opportunity for grit and growth and grace. And in the slowness, before we can kind of ease back into things, I hope none of us is just absolutely like picking right back up where we left off and nothing is different, right? But that slowness, we can see, okay, what needs to happen? What needs to change? What further growth am I being invited into? And I really think that the more we can look at postpartum as an invitation, the better off we'll be, rather than, I can't help X, Y, or Z. This is going to break me. I can't handle this. But just, what am I being invited into here?
Yeah. And that what you said earlier too about postpartum, you truly do have a lot of time to just sit, and
Mm-hmm.
you have two options. You can either be on your phone
Yes. Yes.
and you distract yourself, or you
Yes.
can sit and you can pray, you can think, you can, just kind of reason with your thoughts. It brings up a memory that I have, not necessarily dealing with postpartum stuff, but a few years back, I was sitting in a coffee shop, and I was sitting working, and there was a group of girls that were across the way. They were younger than me, probably high school age, and they were sitting there and just chatting. And of course, I was eavesdropping
Naturally,
conversation
as one does.
naturally. And one of the girls said something that broke my heart. She said they were talking about being on their phones, and she said, "Oh, I I can never sit without being on my phone or like listening to something." And she wasn't even saying this as if it was something she wanted to change about herself. She was simply stating a fact of, I can't sit with my thoughts alone. Oh no, I would never do it. Like if I'm in the car, I'm going to be listening to something, whether it's music. I'm always going to be on my phone. Like, but she said it in a way that it wasn't like I want to get better at that. It was just a
Yes.
statement of fact. Like
Yes.
I can't sit with my thoughts. And I was sitting there just like so saddened for her, and just thinking like, you probably first of all need healing of some sort, and
Sure.
you could receive that healing only within the quiet.
Yes.
And that was something that really, really struck me and just made me sad. And so when I translate that to a postpartum experience, we have especially if we're nursing,
Yes.
that is a time where you are forced to sit down
Yes.
and be. And you
Yes.
can be on your phone, which I do. Yes, I
Yeah.
am.
Same.
I think we all have this, when we're sitting on our phone, breastfeeding, whatever. I'm not trying to demonize that, but
Yeah.
it is also an opportunity to just sit and to
Mhm.
be, and to not take in any more input. And I
Mm.
don't know, are you familiar with Cameron Frad? Do you know who that
Oh
is?
yeah. Yeah.
Matt
Yeah.
Frad?
Yeah.
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 She, in a podcast she did a long, 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 long time ago, I think it was before I even had kids that I heard this, but she called it theology of breastfeeding, which I was like,
Ah.
yes. So it's like, this is for us, well, especially for my Christian listeners here, like when we are moms and we have a ton of kids in tow, we don't have the time to be going to pray at the church at 5 a.m. for an hour before we come home, and all of our things. Like, we need to sleep. We need to be taking care of ourselves, but we also need to pray. When do we find time to do that? Well, in those times when you are forced to sit and be. And so I love that image of like, no, like obviously, yes, we're very busy postpartum,
Sure.
but, and for those of you listening, I have a baby crying in the background. I'm sure you can hear that. So here we
Actually,
go.
no, I did not.
Oh, you didn't? Okay, great.
No.
That means my microphone is working. Good investment. Okay. Anyways, so all that to say, this postpartum time is a really it's an opportunity to sit and be with your thoughts. And even in that discomfort, and even when those thoughts come, to recognize like, they don't have any power over me. This is not me. And I can just let them pass. And of course too, I only know that, and I can only do that because I've worked with a professional to help me be able to do that.
Correct.
So
yes, correct.
absolutely go see someone to help you with that. But yes, I just want to echo what you said of like, this is a time where we have an opportunity to sit with our thoughts, and that's a good thing. It's a very scary thing, but it's a very good thing for us in our own personal healing and like allowing our thoughts to just flow. So
Yes.
anyhow, yeah. It's so good. Well, we are almost at an hour, but I just want to, do you have any other, actually, do you have any tips minus the go to therapy, obviously, like we can just say that, go see a therapist, but do you have any other tips or comments or something that you want to tell the postpartum mom right now who might be struggling either with intrusive thoughts or postpartum depression, or just really struggling through this postpartum time? Like what thoughts, tips do you have for her?
Sure. The very most important thing that I think every mom needs, but I think you need even more if mental health is a struggle of yours, is to form a grandma tribe. And a grandma tribe is a group of women. Oftentimes they're grandma age, but not necessarily. One of our grandma tribe members is a little bit younger. She's single. She's never had children. And then also my best friend is one of our grandma tribe members, and she's in her 30s. But a grandma tribe member is somebody who has a heart to help other people, and specifically can help you with older children that you have and or this baby as well. But sometimes it's a grandma who has grandchildren, but they're grown, or she has grandchildren, but they don't live nearby, right? And so she's somebody who has the time and the heart to help you. And the more that you can ask for and receive help from other people, I think a consequence, a downstream effect of that is that it reassures you that you are worth loving just exactly as you are. And isn't that something that we are all terrified of in our deepest struggles, especially our deepest mental health struggles, is that we are not worthy of loving in our current state. We are not deserving of other people's admiration, respect, and so on and so forth, positive emotions, in the way and the place that we are right now. And the grandma tribe can be a super practical thing. On the one hand, one of our grandma tribe members, Miss Louise, but my children call her Miss Moolise. Miss Moolise comes every Thursday for an hour and a half and helps. She just plays with my kids. She's not a babysitter. I don't pay her, but she just comes every Thursday for an hour and a half and plays with my kids. And it is a built-in time during the week. Sometimes I'm working, but I know I have that time. And this last postpartum, almost every week, except her quilting weekend, almost every week, she has taken my kids for 4 hours. They go to her house, they play. She makes them very fancy macaroni and cheese and hot dogs. And then they come home when it's time for nap time. But what a grandma tribe can look like. I have one of my very first episodes on this, and then a guide, if you go to postpartumonpurpose.com, a guide to finding your own grandma tribe. And then I've got a media tab on the website as well with just different articles I've written about this. So there's plenty of details that you can get into there. But the thing that I most highly recommend, in particular for a mom who is experiencing mental health struggles, is to invite other people in. I know that we want to push people out because we don't want them to know. We don't want them to know how hard things are, and that we don't have it all together, and that we are broken, and that we do need healing. But part of healing, right? Healing always has to happen in community. And so just as much as we need that professional counselor, we need professional assistance as well. I think we also need the practical, tangible reality of somebody else who's coming alongside us, especially if it's somebody who has children of their own and knows what it is like to mother in all ages and stages of life. I just don't think we can replace that.
Yeah. Is this like a is this an official thing for you? Because you keep saying my grandma tribe member, or do you just is that what you call them? Like it sounds kind of like an official thing.
Well, if you Google Grandma Tribe, you'll find the articles I wrote about it. So
Okay, there you go.
I've
Yeah.
made it official.
There you go. There you go. There you go. I was like, does this person know that she is a grandma tribe member to
Oh
you?
yeah.
Like,
Yeah, I tell
okay,
them.
okay,
Yeah,
okay,
I
okay.
tell them because our currency of paying them is like cookies at Christmas time, periodic flowers, right? Like at the bottom of our family Christmas letter, it'll be honorable mention to, and then we'll feature a couple of our Grandma Tribe members. Like, thank you so much to Miss So and So and Mr. Whomever.
That's great.
Yeah. So yes.
That's
Is it
awesome.
formal? By which you mean trademarked? No, it's not trademarked. But can you Google it? Yes, you can.
Okay. You have saying member, so I'm like, is this something that they sign up
That's
for?
what I
Like,
call
what is
No,
this?
that's what I
This is
call
great.
them. I'm like, these are our Grandma Tribe members.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I've like everybody tells you to find your mom tribe or find like your
Yes,
mom friends.
mom
You
squad.
are
Yeah,
so
yeah.
right that your mom tribe, they've got their kids of their own.
Right.
And
Right.
yeah, and as much help as they can be and as much solidarity they can be in with you during this time,
absolutely.
there is something to be said for those grandmas that that is so good.
Yeah.
So yeah. Well, Anne-Marie, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. If somebody wanted to get in contact with you or find your podcast or all the things that you do, where could they go?
Sure. So they can go to postpartumonpurpose.com or on Instagram at postpartumonpurpose. And the podcast is on all the major players as well. It is audio only, but I do also put it on YouTube if somebody wants to listen to it that way as an option. That's there too.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being on.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Truth and Fertility podcast. If you are enjoying this content, please leave a 5-star review. That helps me tremendously. For more information about learning to chart your fertility cycle, you can visit truthandfertility.com, and I'll talk to you guys again next week.